I will be brief because you came to hear our speakers, but just a little warm-up to remind you to reach into your memories for texts from Teresa that you remember, and I may have some questions, or quotations. I receive about twice a month a email that says, where in St. Teresa is this quote? My answer back, nowhere. And as yet, from those inquiries, none of them. The trick with Teresa is she would have wanted to say that. So it sounds like her, whether she said it or not. I'm a lay Carmelite, and it doesn't give me any right to do what I'm going to do, but to say just a few words before the speakers begin, and I introduce them. And it's this. The Carmelites need to make a public apology for one of their great sins. And one of those great sins was to almost put the Bollandists out of business. They were very close to driving the Jesuits out of the enterprise that they had. It takes a lifetime of forgiveness for that sin. And I bring that up because the Carmelites have made in the United States, just a week ago, on October 15th, a step forward in overcoming some of the inward-turned studies in mysticism and spirituality that go on in religious orders, a tendency not to get that information out on the public. Let me give you one instance. I don't think any of our speakers are going to bring this up. There was a book from the 14th century written by a Catalonian provincial, a Paris-trained Carmelite theologian, who took the literature of the last part of the 13th century and the Carmelite literature, were myths and legends, and put them together in a book that they called the Institutio Primorum Monachorum, the institution of the first monks. And they put in the kettle a lot of legend and mythology, and nearly all of it was not history. But there's one item in there that hasn't been well known, and it's this. In the 1960s, when religious orders were becoming anxious to get their story out, now there's none here, I guess I can say this. There are two kinds of Carmelites. There are the shod and the slipshod. And in the 1960s, the OCD, Carmelites, said Teresa and John of the Cross never read the Institutio, period. Don't go any further with it. The O-Carms thought, since they didn't say anything was good in the Carmelite tradition from the 1500 on, that they would put their money on the Institutio. Now both orders, the Calced and the Discalced, agree, and they have to agree, that both John of the Cross and Teresa read the Institutio. And it's very important because while the text is filled with legends and mythology and other untruths, there is a section there that clearly states that the mysticism of the late 14th century that was going on the Rhine and in England was known by the Carmelite writers in the 16th century, including Teresa and John. There is in the second chapter of this book, in fact, a text which gives language that comes right out of the mystics of the Rhineland and England. We know that Teresa read this book or heard this book because in the archives of the Carmelites in Rome is the text of that book. It's a manuscript, and it has a handwriting on one side that's in Latin, and on the other side it's in Spanish. And along the Spanish side says, read this now, read this now. What was going on? That was being read at the table. And Teresa would have heard this. We can also prove it from internal evidence that when Teresa and John speak of the founder of the Carmelites, the prophet Elijah, and denote others, they use precisely the language that comes out of the Institutio. So that Teresa, a major influence, I think. By the way, John of the Cross, we know, read this book because in 1507 it was printed as a text and circulated, and novice masters were supposed to teach it to their novices. So this is a text that goes back into the medieval mysticism, and Teresa and John of the Cross found warranty for what they were writing in that text. There's another instance of in-house material that it's a quaint anecdote, but it's important. In the Second World War, when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, the bishops of the Netherlands deputed a Carmelite who was a philosophy teacher at the University of Nijmegen, and a journalist beside, that he was to go around all of the Netherlands, and there were many Catholic newspapers, and was to tell the editors, you must print this text criticizing National Socialism. And of course, he was picked up a few days later, sent to several prisons, and he died eventually at Dachau, and he died, we didn't know for a long time how, but finally a nurse came to the Carmelite house in the Netherlands and said, I know you don't know how he died. I was the instrument of his death. She was a nurse in the German army. She was told, take this to Titus Brandsma's room and inject him with this. When she went to do that, he said, I don't have anything to give you as a thank you, but my rosaries are here. And she brought the rosaries to the Carmelite house as a warranty for what had happened. Brandsma, and this is early, about time of the First World War, he and a group of other Carmelites decided to translate Teresa from French into Dutch. Nobody translates anything into Dutch, to go the other way around. So that he became well-versed in Teresa. When he had lots of time in the prison he was in, he found a book that they gave him, and he began to write a biography of Teresa interlinearly, in between the lines of that book. He was killed before the book was finished. But he was very devoted to Teresa, and he lectured plenty on her and other Carmelite writers at Nijmegen. So we should get on with today's business, because we have wonderful speakers with great wisdom to pass on to us, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time. First, the order that they'll be in, and then we will let them have the lectern which you're waiting for. Our first speaker, whose book we're celebrating, and why another book on Teresa? Well, there is no end to the writing of books about Teresa. Many layered personality and a richness of soul that just can be commented on from age to age. Professor Carlos Eire is the T. Laureson Phillips Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. He holds a PhD from Yale University specializing in the social, intellectual, religious, and cultural history of late medieval and early modern Europe. He has a strong focus on both the Protestant and Catholic Reformations. I'm present. I had to make this confession to him tonight, that I am reading the Reformations, but only a little bit at a time. I only have so many years to live. It's an 800 and some page long text, filled with saying new things that we need to know. His history of popular piety and the history of the supernatural and the history of death have been topics that he has undertaken. He's the author of many books, including St. Teresa, and the war against the idols, the reformation of worship from Erasmus to Calvin, from Madrid to Purgatory, another, the art and craft of dying in 16th century Spain, and a very brief history of eternity. I think eternity should be brief. And then he has a delightful book, which I hope that I can get a hold of soon, and that is Waiting for Snow in Havana. It's a story of his exile from his native Cuba. Bernard McGinn will be our last, but the next speaker in turn will be Professor Schreiner. Professor Susan Schreiner is Professor Emerita of the History of Christianity and Theology at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago and in the college at the University of Chicago. She holds an MDiv from Harvard University and a PhD from Duke University. She's an historian of early modern Europe. Her research and teaching interests include the Protestant Reformation, early modern Catholicism, and the Renaissance, in addition to her teaching interests that extend to the 20th century Protestant theologians, including Jacques Ellul, Reinhold Niebuhr, Langdon Gilkey, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Karl Barth. That's enough. You can take that in. Professor Schreiner is the author of The Theater of His Glory, Where Shall Wisdom Be Found? Calvin's Exegesis of Job from Medieval and Modern Perspectives, and Are You Alone Wise? The Search for Certainty in the Early Modern Era. Lots and lots of articles, and I noticed that Professor Schreiner is interested in Job. He shows up a lot in that list. And this probably isn't well known, but Teresa, we should know more of this, was a great reader, and she was a voracious reader, and got everything she got her hands on. We know lots, and Professor McGinn has written and spoken on this, a reading of Augustine, but she was very influenced by the Moralia on Job that we know was in the monastery. At the time, women's houses were monasteries, and men's houses in Spain were convents. And we have Teresa, when she was ill, was reading the Moralia, a book that was written or spread widely. And so I'm going to then speak just a moment on Bernard McGinn, who's the National Shanestone Donnelly Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology of the History of Christianity in the Divinity School and the Committees on Medieval Studies and on the General Studies at the University of Chicago. He has written, as you know, extensively about the history of apocalyptic thought, spirituality, and mysticism. Many of you know his Presence of God. Started off writing a couple of volumes, 6 volumes, actually 8 when you put in the number together, and he doesn't seem to have the energy to stop. And we're all, anybody studying mysticism now has to go to school to McGinn, to Bernard McGinn. He will be our final speaker, and then we'll have questions from all of you. So I'm going to turn this session over to Professor Eire, and please take this microphone.
Thank you, Keith. Is this on, or do I need to project? It's on?
I think you need to project.
Oh, I need to project, okay. I have a microphone. It's not turned on. I thought it would be this one. Is that better? Make any difference? Yes. There we go. There we go. Good. Okay. Well, I want to thank the Lumen Christi Institute for bringing me here. It's a great pleasure, a delight, an honor, and to share the stage, if one could call this a stage, with scholars whom I admire so much and have learned so much from. Keith Egan asked, why another book about Teresa? My book is a peculiar book because it's part of a series. So it's actually constructed to fit the mold of the series. Princeton University Press, Lives of Great Religious Books. And it had to fit that mold. And part of that mold was a very strict word limit. So I loved that part of it. To get into the project, I didn't love it so much once I got going because there is so much to say. So in essence, what this book was supposed to do was to write a biography of Teresa's book. Trace it from its very beginnings, why and how it was written, and then its reception to the present day. So that's the content of the book. The editor of the series, Fred Appel, was very glad when I suggested making this book part of the series. An offhand comment, but very telling from him was, oh, we don't have any books in the series written by women. This is the first, and I haven't looked at the complete list yet. Might be the only one for a while. But why Teresa? That remains the question. Why Teresa? Santa Teresa? Why her? Well, I came to study Teresa as a historian of the Protestant Reformation. Although I'm Catholic myself, I was trained as an expert on the Protestant Reformation. So once I started reading about Teresa and reading her texts, I approached her from the perspective of those people that she felt so sorry for and prayed for so fervently, those poor Lutherans. Never saw one in the flesh. She never did, as far as I can tell. There were 59 so-called Lutherans executed in Spain in the 16th century, but they were in Valladolid and Seville. And I don't think she ever met any of them. Or if she met any Lutherans, they were Nicodemites who were faking their Lutheranism. But she knew what they were all about. And it has a lot to do with the way in which this book is shaped, which is that she could not help but be affected by things that she did not know were happening elsewhere, and even by things that were happening in Spain itself that shaped her writing. And there are various issues I could cover, but I want to make this as short and as concise as possible. Her entire life, whether she was aware of it or not, was a denial of most of the central theological teachings of the Protestant Reformation. Being a monastic, being an ascetic, having experiences of the divine, extremely intense personal experiences of the divine, having physical effects from these intense experiences. She knew about those Lutherans, but I think perhaps what she did not know is that they denied that the kind of experiences she was having and the life she was leading, well, the kinds of experiences she was having were impossible or demonic, and that the life she was leading was not at all a good Christian life. So I view Teresa in large measure, as serving a polemical role, a backdrop against which the Protestant Reformation seems slightly different, or depending on what phenomenon you're looking at, quite different. Let me be more specific. Teresa wrote her so-called autobiography not because she wanted the world to know about herself, her life, but because she was ordered to do so. Several writers, beginning in the 1980s, started referring to her life as a judicial document. Against the backdrop of the Protestant Reformation, against the backdrop of what was happening in Spain, it was very dangerous for any nun or monk, or actually for any human being, to seem slightly or greatly out of the ordinary in terms of the life of the spirit. Part of the backdrop is that in Spain, there were people accused of a very specific heresy, but the definition of that heresy is rather vague, and there's still a lot of scholarly debate about it. Alumbradismo, the enlightened, who claimed that one could, in fact, get very, very close to the divine and experience the divine and be filled with the divine. And as the Inquisition constructed the charges against them, and there's difference of opinion on whether those charges were accurate or not, the claim was made that since one's will became one with the divine, anything one did could not be a sin. That's what the Alumbrados were charged with. So along comes this sickly nun who was very ill in her early years and into middle age, who suddenly starts having these otherworldly experiences. And of course, people talk, especially in monastic circles, they talk about each other. She has read certain books that actually, in fact, I'm so glad, Keith, that you mentioned this manuscript, right? Because all the scholarly literature attributes the influx of Rhineland mysticism to Spain from translated texts that were actually published in the early and middle 16th century. Some of which she actually did read and was very influenced by, especially the practice of recogimiento, or recollection, moving inward. And you say, well, what does that have to do with Rhineland mysticism? Well, it has everything to do with the Rhineland mystical notion that there's a spark of the soul. The presence of the divine is within. So one goes within in prayer to find the divine. And also the practice of dejamiento, which is to let go. Also very 14th century Rhineland, Gelassenheit. But then Francisco de Osuna, a Spanish mystic, had a book, The Third Spiritual Alphabet, in which there's this practice recommended of silent prayer. What is silent prayer? Silent prayer, as far as some were concerned in 16th century Spain, who were looking at Teresa nervously, skirts way too close to alumbradismo, because the claim is made that when one becomes close enough to the divine and proficient and prays and lives the right way, one can enter a state of wordless prayer, and the divine takes over. That was what got Teresa into the most trouble. Claiming this was dangerous. So anyway, to cut to the chase, she is asked by her superiors, confessors, and there are inquisitors involved, to do precisely what everyone who is brought in by the Inquisition is asked to do. It's not like the American judicial system, the Spanish Inquisition. You're brought in, you do not know what you're being suspected of, and you're asked to write the story of your life. except in Teresa's case, of course, it's much longer than everything. She had constant editorial assistance. What she was writing, which was over a period of time, was read by various confessors, superiors, advisors, inquisitors, and by the time she finished, she had proven that she was not an alumbrada, that she was not demonically inspired. But how did she do this? She did this very, very carefully. She did it very carefully by various means. And one of these means, which has gotten a lot of attention for the past 20 years or so, my former colleague at the University of Virginia, Alison Weber, refers to this as the rhetoric of femininity. Here is this woman who is having all of these strange experiences, making all these claims. Well, this woman constantly in her autobiography displays the trait that one is supposed to display if one is not a heretic: humility, and also another trait, obedience. And she does this throughout the text, constantly reminding her readers, oh, I'm sorry, I am just a woman. I do not have a university degree from Alcalá or from Salamanca. I don't know the correct terms for things. And also I'm a woman. So please, forgive my lack of clarity and correct me. Correct me if I am wrong. And there's one passage in the Vita where she actually uses 5 or 6, I think it's maybe 7 different terms to describe the different experiences in Spanish terms, including arrobamiento, vuelo del espíritu, a long list, translated variously into English. But at the end she says, but they're all one, and it's called ecstasy. Proving she knows the terms. She doesn't want to distinguish between them. What matters to her more is the experience itself. And she has this one term, ecstasy, for what happens. And one set of incidents alone shows the process of writing, and it shows up as a story in her autobiography. Her confessors are telling her that her visions of Christ are demonic and that she must be more careful. And at one point she is told, the next time that Christ shows up, give him the fig. A very bad gesture, as bad as our middle finger. Old monastic advice on how to deal with the devil. The devil is awful, so the devil is crude. You do crude things to the devil. Luther, by the way, followed the same advice. He said, nothing can chase the devil away better than a good, strong fart. That's not St. Teresa. And she uses holy water and a crucifix to chase away the devil. But Christ shows up. She gives him the fig. This is the story as she tells it. And Christ says, thank you. Thank you for being obedient. Thank you for listening to your confessors. But tell them, I'm not the devil. In the same way that she would say, this is the disarming quality of the autobiography, which is such a unique book. I'm sorry, I'm a woman, and I don't have university degrees, and I don't know how to explain this properly, and it's beyond words. But, by the way, I had a full experience of the Trinity, and I understood it. I just can't tell you how or why or what it was or how to describe it. So, left hook, right hook. And the book is locked up. The manuscript, actually copies are made and they're circulated and so on, but a huge clamp is placed on it and it's under lock and key. One copy actually ends up in the hands of the king himself, Philip II, who has heard of this nun, and actually it helps her a lot that King Philip II is interested in her. But the book is under lock and key while Teresa lives. It's considered too shocking, too dangerous, too risky to circulate. And after her death, of course, especially after her incorruptible body is dug up and cut into little pieces through a method that André Vaucher has described as only a French historian could, as découpage millimétrique, cutting it up into little pieces. Beatification, canonization procedures are set into place. By 1622, she's canonized. And you would think that her texts made smooth sailing from that point on, but no. Luis de Leon collects the texts. The first edition of her obras, or works, is published. Before that, and immediately after that, she is still being denounced to the Inquisition by several Dominicans, still accusing her of alumbradismo and heresy. And there are a good number of these accusations. Even after the obras are published, accusations continue to be made about her orthodoxy, and pleas to the Inquisition to actually remove this book from circulation because it's so bad. And just so you should know, there were also several Dominicans, including the great theologian Melchor Cano, who had similar views on Ignatius Loyola and his orthodoxy. One of the reasons that Loyola ends up in Paris is that he too was accused of alumbradismo. And a recent biography of Ignatius by Garcia Hernan, the two surnames, now the first name is escaping me, a biography of Ignatius in Spanish, Garcia Hernan actually argues, and somewhat convincingly, I think, that yes, Ignatius must have had at least rubbed shoulders with alumbrados at some point, and that his spiritual exercises, which he was administering to people as a layperson, the Inquisition might not have been too harsh in dragging him in, or too wrong in suspecting him of this. It was a constant problem for anyone who dared to speak about a life of prayer and encounters with the divine. So, that's the book. That's its trajectory. 1622, she's canonized. All denunciations to the Inquisition cease. And by the way, I love the fact that the Inquisition, by the late 16th century, beginnings of the 17th century, when they received these denunciations, what they did is one of the things they did best, which was to just simply file the accusations away for later generations to discover and do nothing about them. They knew. The book has an immensely interesting life after its publication. It's translated into various vernaculars, and it's also, of course, translated into Latin. Repeated editions, repeated translations in various languages, up until the 18th century, when along comes the Enlightenment and there's something of a lull. But then it's rediscovered in the 19th century, and then again, even more so, one would say with a vengeance in the 20th century, and especially English translations in the 20th century and into the 21st century too. Extremely popular book, up until the 20th century, extremely popular book with Catholics, of course, but especially after Vatican II, very ecumenical interest in Teresa's life, which gives her a much broader audience. I used to think that those theorists who dealt with deconstruction were all wrong back when I was young and foolish. I used to think that until I saw the first book reviews of my first book and realized a text does have a life of its own. And actually a reader might actually find things in one's writing that are not there at all or are interpreted incorrectly. That's the life of every book. Interaction between the reader and the text. The life of Teresa has had such a life, especially after the Enlightenment. And one of the more interesting features of this interpretation is how her experiences have been interpreted in art. And I think Bernie McGinn has lots to show us about this. And especially there's one of her experiences in particular that has attracted the most attention from artists is the so-called Transpiration. And you'll see. But psychiatrists have taken an enormous interest in Teresa beginning in the 19th century. William James, in Varieties of Religious Experience, very interested in Teresa. She's healthy, right? But it's problematic. In the 20th century, the great Lacan, without reading her text and just simply looking at Bernini's sculpture of Teresa, declares her a hysteric and says, well, you know how women are. It's Lacan, I'm paraphrasing Lacan. You know how women are. They don't even know when they're having an orgasm. They don't know how to recognize it. And that's what was happening to Teresa. Something that would make Teresa's blood boil. But there's the 20th century, and there's 20th century ways of approaching things. I'll end with this, two things. In the 1930s in Spain, she ends up being turned into a fascist, and the perfect fascist woman by Franco and other fascists. And Francisco Franco ends up rescuing the relic of one of her hands from the Republicans, the Reds, who didn't know what they had. But from that day forward, Franco kept the hand with him, took it everywhere he went. One of the greatest Spanish experts on Spanish mysticism in the 20th century, Pedro Sainz Rodriguez, had this chilling story to tell that for some reason he was involved in some cultural thing. He had to go see Francisco Franco. He walks into the office, and there is the great caudillo sipping hot chocolate and signing death orders. The hand of Teresa right next to him. He also claimed it saved his life on a winding mountain road when a car door opened and he failed to fall out. And this story gets repeated numerous times in Spanish culture, 20th century. But in America, I'm relating this story to a class, and of course, this is what happens when you teach young people. You learn things. Hand goes up. Professor Eire, maybe the hand opened the door. So she ends up being a fascist, a hysteric, a nymphomaniac, and all these other things. At the very same time, just about 1970, she's declared a doctor of the church, along with Catherine of Siena. And by the way, Alison Weber, I just heard her give a very wonderful paper. Did Teresa read Raymond of Capua's Life of Catherine of Siena? And there's plenty of evidence that she must have. She must have had. But Catherine and Teresa, first two women declared doctors of the church. A little late, but as some might say, perhaps better late than never. What I find very interesting, and I'll end with this, because her life, her writing, her autobiography, you can't make any sense out of it if you don't think of it as a primer on prayer. She's declared Doctor of Prayer. Her friend, her close friend, John of the Cross, will later also be made a doctor of the church, doctor of mysticism. Should those two titles be that different? I think Teresa would say that the two things cannot be separated, but this is the way you identify these doctors. So Teresa is now not just for Catholics. It's quite evident that she has a wide ecumenical reach, and the life is the best door, I think, into not just her life story, but her life of prayer and her mysticism. And it can be a very powerful book. There are numerous conversion narratives, people who encounter the book, sometimes by accident, and lives are changed, including none other than Edith Stein, who not only converted from Judaism, became a Catholic, but became a Carmelite nun, and ended up martyr at Auschwitz. And I have this great kind of fear of 19th and 20th century Germanic philosophy and theology. So I was very glad to read that many of her contemporaries thought that Edith Stein was smarter than Heidegger. And I'll end with that.
I have a very brief response or just observations about Professor Eire's book before I return to Professor McGinn, who evidently has an entire show. But first, I would like to thank Professor Eire for writing such an informative and illuminating book about Teresa's Vita, as well as all of the other books that he has given us, not only Waiting for Snow in Havana, but Learning to Die in Miami. It's great. Now, let's assume that I've been asked to participate in this symposium because I'm the token Protestant here. I am a scholar of the 16th century Reformations. I am a great admirer of Luther and Calvin. I'm also someone who has taught and admired Teresa and other 16th century Catholic mystics and writers. Professor Eire has explained that although Teresa did not know Protestant theology, she did become associated with anti-Protestant polemic. For example, her spiritual experience of the pains of hell, a very brief one evidently, made her feel compassion, as he has indicated, for all of the damned, especially Lutheran heretics. And I'm very grateful for that little compassion of hers, because I'm Lutheran. Professor Eire recounts the words of an early biographer of Teresa, who wrote the following: "This too was planned by God, that at almost the same time that the wicked Luther began to plot his lies and deceptions, and to concoct the poison with which he would later kill so many, he should also be forming this sainted woman so that she could serve as an antidote to his poison." Now, as Professor explains, even though Teresa did not or could not argue point by point with Protestant theology, nonetheless, and I'm quoting him, every page of her text screamed as loudly as humanly possible, "Protestants are wrong, and my life proves it." While Teresa's Vita was not a polemical text in the sense that John Eck or so forth, it is almost impossible to read her Vita without this wider context of Protestantism, or the fear of it, especially since the suspicion of Protestantism was a major factor in the removal of her book, or Illuminism at least. I have two questions or observations that occurred to me while reading this text. The first deals with the way that Professor Eire so clearly delineates the differences between Protestant and Catholic thought, differences exemplified by Teresa. He states 6 main contrasts. 1, Protestants denied the possibility of moral and spiritual perfection. And this is clear from his conclusion that Teresa's text proposes an optimistic evaluation of human existence and human potential. You can never accuse Luther and Calvin of that. Protestants, number 2, devalued asceticism. Thirdly, Protestants denied the effectiveness of monasticism. 4, Protestants claimed that the Catholic Church was in the grip of Satan. And 5, Protestants tended to be uncomfortable with the mingling of spirit and matter. And finally, number 6, Protestants denied that one could have intimate and ecstatic encounters with God. It's this last point that I wanted to discuss, or just to raise an observation. Clearly, delineated accounts of mystical ascents and raptures or ecstasies were not characteristic of the early reformers. Nobody levitated in Luther's circles. However, intense controversies arose amongst the various reformers with regard to the claim that one had experienced an immediate or direct revelation from the Holy Spirit. Such divine experiences became central amongst Protestants. Thomas Müntzer went so far as to defend visions and revelations. Members of the more spiritualist branch of the so-called Radical Reformation claimed that without the direct experience of the Spirit illuminating the mind, one could not understand Scripture. Those who were inexperienced, which was a term that was bandied about quite a bit, those who were inexperienced or who did not have an experiential faith were not true believers. Moreover, we find the use of mystical terms such as the abyss of the soul, or the inner word, or the annihilation of the self, the union of human and divine wills throughout many of these texts. All of these terms were usually based, or at least the appeal was made to John 6:45, namely, they shall all be taught by God, which depicted an immediacy with the divine that served to make inner experience a source of spiritual authority. Such spirituality was not unique to the radicals, for inner illumination of the Spirit is also a prominent but differently phrased or differently understood theme in Luther and in Calvin. At one place, Calvin is commenting on Corinthians, and he makes it clear, if you have not had this experience, you're damned. Moreover, this phenomenon is also evident, of course, in Spain, in the Alumbrados, and in the Spirituali in Italy. The 16th century has rightly been called the Great Age of the Spirit. So I'm wondering, how would you place Teresa in the midst of this 16th century wave of spiritualism that spread throughout the continent? Clearly, there were different sources, although, as we've seen, they're not totally distinct. Protestant spiritualism was inspired by late medieval mysticism, particularly with the idea of Gelassenheit at the center of its theology. Catholic spiritualism often revolved more around the practice of recollection. Nonetheless, in various degrees, both made experience essential and appealed to the authority of this transformative divine experience. And both were concerned about the certainty that such experiences were divine and not demonic. They were both interested in the importance of interiority and the inner teaching of the divine. Was Teresa a further example or a part of this 16th century spiritualism, or is she best understood basically within the tradition of Catholic mysticism and tradition, or if both, how do you see them related? My second observation consists in the way that the Vita was used throughout the centuries. Professor Eire has explained that the book is not really a biography of Teresa, it's a biography of her book, the Vita. Particularly important is his description of the history of the Vita's interpretation as a Rorschach test that actually reveals more about the interpreter and his or her era than the text itself. From Catholic devotional spirituality to fascism, nationalism, psychoanalytic theories, the Vita has been through a lot. Especially delicious for me is the discussion of the Vita in the later 20th and 21st centuries. And I simply cannot refrain from mentioning two of his examples. Feminist theories have argued that Teresa employed covert and subversive strategies because, as a woman, she needed to escape the Inquisition and the male-dominated society. And as such, the Vita gradually became a book by many authors about female empowerment, and Teresa was a proto-feminist. The Vita has also been sexualized by queer theorists who argue, quotes, that the text was written in the epistemological space of the closet. Her writing reveals a female homoeroticism, and her mystical experiences are seen as sexual or interpreted in terms of sexual encounters. Therefore, besides being a proto-feminist, she is also a proto-lesbian. Now, speaking for myself, in my humble view, there are simply no words to express the stupidity and the narcissism of these kinds of interpretations, which are also insulting to historical thinking. There is no doubt that Teresa struggled as a female writer who sought to explain mystical theology, and this is proven by the fact that she used this vocabulary and that the Inquisition did find her book suspect. She did have to defend the divine authenticity of her mystical experiences, and she often did so with this rhetoric of femininity. But Ignatius of Loyola also had plenty of run-ins with the Inquisition. In fact, the luncheon that he had with the Dominican inquisitor, he sits down with the guy, and the first thing he starts talking about are all of his mystical experiences. They never even met, okay? So, I mean, he got himself in a certain amount of trouble, too. So, Ignatius also, as I said, had plenty of inquisitions. Both Teresa and Ignatius had to overcome the fear of Illuminism, or being an alumbrado or alumbrado. This does not, however, make Teresa a proto-feminist. In the feminist interpretations that I have read, the authors often find Teresa's frequent statements of humility and worthlessness and submission to be this subversive strategy within her only outwardly submissive narrative. Some of that's true. But instead of seeing her avowals, I think the references to humility and my worthlessness, he said, is multi-layered. Instead of seeing all of her avowals of worthlessness and humility, in Teresa's own terms, they're often regarding self-knowledge and the discernment of the spirits. And humility is a central theme because, as Teresa says, it is the foundation of prayer, which requires a painful knowledge of the self. Moreover, Teresa was often, not always, but often, less fearful of the male-dominated society than the deceptions of the devil. But to recognize her multi-layered theology of humility requires actual historical thinking. Her depiction of mystical union in erotic terms derives also from a long tradition of such use that employed the Song of Songs and bridal imagery to explain the unitive relationship between humanity and God. That doesn't make her a proto-lesbian, or quotes, I'm quoting a secondary author here, cited by Professor Eire, that symbol of the queers of all nations, that she is the symbol of the queers of all nations, sexes, and colors who have resisted obliteration even as they continue to endure social isolation, dispersion, and silencing, unquote. Now, historians have long been lectured and browbeaten to understand that all interpretation is fluid and that we can never know the original intent of the author. The fact that there is, however, a field of valid readings of a text does not make all interpretations valid. Historical thinking demands that we listen to the text, and listening is always very hard work. And listening to a historical text means shutting up. It means getting out of our own way. Professor Eire tells us, or warns us, that Teresa's Vita is full of claims that contemporary readers would find, quotes, bizarre, insane, or fraudulent. Nonetheless, it may be precisely the strangeness of this book that makes it valuable today. If we were to listen, we might hear different questions and different views of the divine and human relationship. And Professor Eire has shown that the greatness of this book is evident from its long history of interpretation. So I conclude by asking what a skeptical, secular 21st century person can learn from the Vita without twisting it into their own image. Can its very strangeness teach us something today? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schreiner. And you'd like to know, I would think, and maybe you know this already, that not only your decision about claims of certain contemporary writers, like Teresa, in her own time, yes, males referred to her as varonil. She was a manly woman. They thought that was the ultimate compliment. Professor McGinn.
I had to bring the pictures along for Susan. I actually like pictures so much. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here, especially with my old friend Carlos Eire, and to say a few things about more about the reception of the book that inspired me in terms of reading it. I very much admired Carlos's wonderful little book, The Life of St. Teresa of Ávila Biography, as you can see from the endorsement that I wrote on the back cover. I could go on in praise of the book's many virtues, but as I thought about what I might say to contribute to this event, I was struck by the fact that two of the greatest cultural receptions of the life were being produced at the same time, the late 1640s in Rome, by two great masters of the Baroque, Gian Lorenzo Bernini in art and Richard Crashaw in poetry. This, of course, is not news to Carlos, since both figures come in for revealing treatment in his book. Although Teresa and her book took on different colorations in different historical eras, seems to be a special affinity between the saint's ecstasies, transverberations, levitations, and the exuberant, emotional, sensuous spirituality that we associate with the book, with the Baroque, rather. The Vita had been rapidly translated into many languages. Teresa was canonized in 1622. And in the decades that followed, she became what might be called the icon of ecstasy. The icon of ecstasy, primarily among Catholics, but also for some Protestants. So let me start with the chronological coincidence that struck me. Richard Crashaw, 1613 to 49, was the son of a virulently anti-Catholic Puritan. Much of his life was passed in Cambridge, where he joined the Laudian wing of the Anglican Church. He had to flee Cambridge in 1643 under threat from the Puritan parliamentarians and their attack on Archbishop Laud and his supporters. In 1644, Crashaw went to the Low Countries, where he converted to Catholicism, and in 1645 was in Paris, where he received support from the exiled Queen Henrietta Maria, the wife of Charles I. By now a Catholic priest, Crashaw went on to Rome, where he served in various ecclesiastical positions in the entourage of Cardinal Palotta between 1646 and 1649. In April of 1649, he was made canon of the Holy House of the Virgin Mary in Loreto, where he died on August 21st, 1649, possibly of poison. Crashaw read Teresa's Vita and came to see her as the epitome of sanctity. He himself had a reputation for prayer and holiness of life. The anonymous preface to the reader in his 1646 collection of poems, The Steps to the Temple, speaks of him as our divine poet, whose poems can lift the reader some yards above the ground. After his early death, his friend, the poet Abraham Cowley, proclaimed, "Poet and saint, to thee alone are given the two most sacred names of earth and heaven." Crashaw wrote 3 poems on Teresa. The first of these, a hymn to the name and honor of the admirable Saint Teresa, appeared in the 1646 collection and was written while he was still a Protestant. So he's reading Teresa as a Protestant and very much inspired by her. The second poem is an apology for the foregoing hymn as having been writ when the author was yet among the Protestants. While the third is The Flaming Heart, which he seems to have written sometime between 1646 and 49. Now, Crashaw habitually reworked his poems, as we can see from the final posthumous collection of 1652. So while he was in Rome, 1646-49, he's reworking the poems, and I imagine actually writing the third of those poems, The Flaming Heart. During this very same time, Gian Lorenzo Bernini lost a lot of his papal patronage under the new Pope Innocent X, but was approached in 1647 by the Venetian Cardinal Federico Cornaro to decorate the left nave of the small Carmelite church of Santa Maria della Vittoria as a burial ground for the Cornaro family. Bernini accepted and worked away on the total program of the Cornaro Chapel down until 1651, and when this magnificent Gesamtkunstwerk, the total program of art, 1659, when it was finally opened to the public, along with his famous statue, St. Teresa in Ecstasy. So these two artists are working on their works at exactly the same time, although there's no evidence that either one was aware of the other. I'm first going to show you a little bit about Bernini's work, and then I hope to be able to say a little bit about the poems. Not too much, so that I can see. I quote Carlos here. It could be argued that Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa is not just the most remarkable Baroque sculpture, but also the most daring, and also the best known. Carlos also argues, convincingly I think, that the statue captures the coincidence of opposites present in mystical experience, especially the famous Transverberation, the seraph or cherub piercing Teresa's heart with a spear. This is in chapter 29, by the way, of the Vita. I'd like to make just a few comments on this image about which so much has been written. It's really a true classic. That is, it's something that is always open to further interpretation. And Bernini himself seems to have recognized the special status of this piece among his vast oeuvre. His biographer tells us that in his old age, he is reputed to have sometimes been seen praying before the statues and saying that it was one of my least bad works. One of my least bad works. Now, the slide doesn't give you the sense of the entire program, because above this scene above the altar, the famous Transverberation itself, there's a huge kind of proscenium arch with stucco work, a heavenly vision, angels appearing, all sorts of stuff going on. And then, of course, the whole chapel, designed by Bernini, parts of it executed by other artists, however, is designed to present the image, this image of ecstasy, in the middle of the kind of ecclesiological setting. And we can have the next slide. I think the next slide will show you more. Yeah. Federico Carnaro here is this figure, and the rest of the figures in these two, they're sometimes described as kind of, theater boxes or something. That's not really possible. I think it's much more likely it's a kind of triptych with the scene of Teresa in the middle, and then the admiring and discussing members, cardinals, and bishops of the Cornaro family, kind of as part of the ongoing scene. And there's, on one side, as you walk down the aisle, actually, the only person who's looking out to you is Cornaro, Federico Cornaro. The others are all gazing at the image or else seeming to be engaged in discussion. And if we look at the other side, next slide. The next slide, I think, would be a little bit more clear, yeah. Well, here's some more of these Cornaro folk looking on. Down below the altar, which I don't have slides of, is a Eucharistic focus. There's a bas-relief of the Last Supper. And then on the floor, the marble floor of the chapel, there's a very rich marble decoration, and you have two half-skeletons praying. I think figures being released from purgatory in a certain sense through the patronage of the saint. A lot more could be said about this, but I want to at least give you a sense of what's going on. And the image itself, which is the ultimate Baroque ecstatic image, you might say. But I want to have some time to say just a little bit about our friend Richard Crashaw as well. If we could have the lights back up a little bit, thanks. I'll leave that image on, though. So, Crashaw. Crashaw's hymn to the name and honor of the admirable Saint Teresa first appeared in the 1646 text in the Temple, certainly written earlier, though. According to Austin Warren, and I quote him, "In the hymn, one of Crashaw's 4 or 5 best pieces, he unites the two themes intensely dear to him, martyrdom and mysticism." The hymn falls into 3 parts. The first 2 are based on incidents in Teresa's life. The third part projects the reader into the saint's apotheosis in heaven. So the 3 parts of the poem really describe the saint's ascent to glory, beginning on earth in her childhood, moving to the heaven on earth of the ecstasy of the mature Teresa in the Transverberation, and ending with the full reward in heaven itself. The overarching theme of the poem is love, as announced with the sonorous O sounds of the opening lines. "Love, thou art absolute sole Lord of life and death." But Crashaw doesn't present love in general, but love as mystical marriage and inner martyrdom. In setting forth his case, he begins by mentioning those thy old soldiers, great and tall, ripe men of martyrdom. But he concentrates not on the great martyrs of the past, but on the milky soul of a soft child. That is the 6-year-old Teresa, who tells us in Life, chapter 1, of her attempt to go off to the moors to suffer martyrdom. Along with the theme of love, part 1 introduces other key words: blood, heart, fire, death. This part explores the paradoxes of the child Teresa, desiring what she does not really know, but still functioning as an exemplar of the martyrdom of love. I quote again, "She never undertook to know what death with life should have to do, yet though she cannot tell you why, she can love and she can die." The ancient theme of the mystical death, mors mystica, strung in many of Teresa's works, is a constant in Crashaw's Teresa poem. This is why the saint's true home is only where she can become a martyr. Since 'tis not to be had at home, she'll travel for a martyrdom. No home for her confesses she, but where she may a martyr be. The home for Teresa's martyrdom, however, not going to be the land of the Moors, but actually the Carmelite convent of the Bride of Christ. So the second part of the poem starts with the turn to the mystical life. Sweet, not so fast. Lo, thy fair spouse, whom thou seek'st with so swift vows, calls thee back and bids thee come to embrace a milder martyrdom. And this part of the poem is based on the transverberation scene from chapter 29 of the life. In her new location, now in the convent, Teresa hears the words, "Thou art love's victim and must die, a death more mystical and high." The meditative descant that follows on the transverberation account, this is lines 79 to 119, it's one of the longest presentations of ecstasy in all poetry. Begins with a description of the wounding dart of love. His is the dart must make the death, whose stroke shall taste thy hallowed breath. A dart thrice dipped in that rich flame, which writes thy spouse's radiant name upon the roof of heaven. This is followed by a description of love's soldiers, the seraphim who bear the dart, as we saw in the image. The result is the sweet pain of mystical death. Oh, how oft shalt thou complain of the sweet and subtle pain of intolerable joys, of a death in which who dies loves his death and dies again and would forever so be slain. Teresa's wounded not just once, but continuously, so that the wounds weep healing balsam until they come together to melt her soul into a single lump of incense in order to exalt her to heaven where she'll be welcomed. So the third and last part of the poem is a hymn to the glorified Teresa. Crashaw doesn't try to describe heaven in detail. Rather, he pictures the greeting the saint receives from the whole heavenly court, especially her divine spouse. All her good deeds will be waiting for her, so that all in one shall weave a constellation of crowns with which the king thy spouse shall build up thy triumphant brows. Teresa will also see the effects that her book is having in the world, as well as the thousands of crowned souls who, inspired by her words and example, are following the Lamb to heaven. The last lines, "And so thou with the Lamb thy Lord shalt go, and wheresoe'er he sets his white steps, walk with him those ways of light, which who in death would live to see, must learn in life to die like thee." I won't say anything about the second poem, the Apology, but I just want to close with a few comments about the last poem of the trilogy, The Flaming Heart. The poem definitely written while he was a Catholic, and I think almost certainly in Rome. This poem begins with an extended conceit on the piercing of Teresa's heart. Crashaw had seen a picture of a small seraph plunging his spear into the passive, swooning figure. But he felt that the image got it all wrong. Teresa and her love of God should be the active figure, the angel, the mere bystander. In a typical metaphysical conceit, Crashaw writes, "You must transpose the picture quite and spell it wrong to read it right. Read him for her and her for him, and call the saint the seraphim." For some 68 lines, he goes on with various versions of this. It goes on and on and on. But the wounded heart is love's best weapon because it can pierce others with the example of its love. He says, "Live here, great heart, and love and die and kill and bleed and wound and yield and conquer still. Let this immortal life, where'er it comes, walk in a crowd of loves and martyrdoms. Let mystic death wait on't, and let wise souls be the love-slain witnesses of this life of thee." That's where the poem ended in the 1648 version. In the posthumous version, in Carmen Deo Nostro, there's a kind of addition to the end, which Louis Marx has called the richest fiery shower of Baroque imagery to be found anywhere in Crashaw's poetry. It's the shower that turns subjective because it's the personal prayer of the poet to the saint, a plea for mystical transformation. And it ends with a kind of ecstatic liturgy, which I'm going to close by quoting. O thou undaunted daughter of desires, by all thy dower of lights and fires, by all the eagle in thee, all the dove, by all thy lives and deaths of love, by all thy large draughts of intellectual day, and by thy thirst of love more large than they, by all thy brim-filled bowls of fierce desire, by thy last morning's draught of liquid fire, by the full kingdom of the final kiss that sees thy parting soul and sealed thee his, by all the heavens thou hast in him, fair sister of the seraphim, by all of him we have in thee, leave nothing of myself in me. Let me so read thy life that I unto all life of mine shall die. Mors Mystica. Thank you.
Yeah, great multiple question. But also in response to Professor Schreiner's comment. Yeah, my point number 6, which is related to your question. Yeah, well, I'm focusing on early Protestantism, and especially on the magisterial reformers. I'm quite aware of the fact that in the radical tradition, which I prefer to call the alternative Reformation, there's definite mystical influence. And Thomas Müntzer, yes, no one can be a true pastor without visions, is the extreme. So it's overdrawn, yes, when you think of later Protestantism. There are passages in Jonathan Edwards that I have come across. I wasn't looking for it, but I've come across passages in Jonathan Edwards where, he's having the most intimate relation with Christ. That just kind of border, coming close to this kind of intimate encounter. So one must think of the what I have set up as some kind of binary structure. Catholicism, Protestantism. One has to think long-term, linearly, in terms of time and chronology. That of course the differences morph with the centuries, with decades and centuries. The differences morph, and you get to the 20th century. And someone like Evelyn Underhill, for heaven's sakes, this woman is just transforming in England Anglican attitudes towards Catholic mysticism in ways that no one could have foreseen in the 17th, 18th, even 19th century. But the last part of your question, if I understood correctly, but Teresa's Catholicism has to say to the present, am I getting it correct? Well, that there's a richness in the Catholic tradition, which is the small c in Catholic, this universalism, right? That there's this richness in the Catholic tradition that we see that there are so many different kinds of Catholicism. And in the 17th century, in the 16th century, in Teresa's own day, she's viewed as a nun, as a monastic. This is not for lay people, this kind of life, these kinds of experiences. It's kind of a closed circle. But yet, this is what some of these Dominicans who wanted her books removed from the market were objecting to, is the fact, you're letting lay people read this, right? But there's this richness, the mystical tradition, in many circles in Catholic culture, here in North America, and also in Europe to some extent, depending on which country you're in. the mystical tradition in some Catholic circles is underplayed and undervalued. And in many cases, it's even found somewhat embarrassing, especially the physical phenomena of mysticism. I know nothing elicits laughter quicker than a lecture on levitation. And also recoil on the part of some Catholics. But this she's part of the pantheon of sorts of items that are crucial to the Catholic tradition that I think, not just as a scholar, but as a Catholic, I think deserve more constant attention. Well, to be honest with you, I know absolutely nothing about Latin American Pentecostalism. Zero. And I'll be upfront with you about that. But I can see how, yes, this would have an impact. There are many European saints who end up having a tremendous influence in the Spanish colonies, and also in Brazil. But one nun I've been working on, Sor Maria de Agreda, her book, The Mystical City of God, ends up having, there's a book that just came out, and I'm ashamed to say I can't remember either the title or the author, but it's 2018, is on the influence that Maria de Agreda has on Latin American literature. Very surprising ways. So those who are digging are finding. And there's plenty more digging that can be done, and especially in the case of Teresa. I have found, apropos the transverberation, I have found many images of the transverberation from Latin America that are either copies or interpretations of European engravings. And the transverberation has a very rich life in Latin American art, ecclesiastical art. But how it relates to Pentecostalism, I'm not so sure. But all I can say is, back to what I said before, this is what these Dominicans who thought she was a heretic were so upset about, is that, she was, lay people could read this and have experiences of their own. And as my mentor, Steve Osment, used to say repeatedly when he was teaching, and he's got this wonderful book, Mysticism and Descent, right, that links the radicals with medieval mystics. But he was something of a cynic, and would often say, well, how are you going to keep the people in the church after they've seen God? To point out the inherent danger in all mystics and all mysticism. They bypass the sacramental system, they bypass the hierarchy. If you can connect with God one-on-one, well, especially in 21st century Catholic churches in North America, why would you put up with all that horrible music?